It's negative.
All right.
All right, so we are live now, but we're not going to get started yet. We're going to give it a couple of minutes. I live by a general policy that you can always be plus or minus 5 minutes to an event.
Oh yeah.
I don't. I think 5 minutes might be a little too much for a live stream when people expect us to start on time. But then again, if anyone knows me, they know I also don't start on time. So we'll give it 3 minutes.
I know that all too well, Michael. Yeah, from our weekly catch-ups.
Do you know the worst thing is, like, I think we used to do syncs. What was it like? Was it 5 or 6 o'clock for your time?
It was quite late. Yeah, it was. Not. Oh no, that was the CSS course. They were 7 p.m. my time.
Okay.
Because Case back when he was there, he wanted to do much later ones. But then when Case went and Rachel came on, we made them a lot earlier because we were all
Rachel's
either
UK based
or
too,
East
right?
Coast. Yeah, so me and Rachel literally live half an hour down the road from each other.
Hello, Samir. Just gonna say hi real quick. Sorry, Andy.
Yeah, and that's it. So yeah, we live really close, and everyone else is on the East Coast. So it's like, oh, could we make this maybe not in the evening anymore? And it worked out much better.
Well,
on that front.
I was only going to mention because now I'm working with a team based in Israel, so like my morning meetings are even earlier, and so I'm like, cool, just taking meetings in bed now.
Israel, I'm trying to think where they are UTC wise. Are they plus 2 UTC or are they minus 2 maybe?
I think it's plus 2 because you're plus 0, right?
No, we're plus 1 because it's summer. We're UTC in the winter. Yeah, that's what GMT is. Yeah, I think that's right. Don't make me think about dates.
The problem is you're talking like
horror.
What do you say? UMT, and I'm thinking GMT. I don't know. It is UTC
GMT,
plus 3.
Yeah. Oh wow. So yeah, it's a heck of a time difference for you. Yeah.
Yeah. And we actually, our community manager Sarav, who's kindly helping us run this event. What is the time for him right now? Because I know it's late.
Must be late.
It's 9:30 for Sarav. So
wow.
Sarav, thank you for being up so late. All right. We are about 3 minutes in, so I think this is as good a time as any to start. Okay. So, everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we have Andy Bell, a amazing front-end developer, CSS whiz. He's taught me everything I need to know and know about designing or web app user experiences, CSS experiences. I still obviously have a lot to learn, so I'm going to defer to Andy moving forward for this event. Andy has had experience working with tons of different companies, including Google. Specifically, if you guys have visited web.dev, he basically helped redesign that entire website almost from scratch, I think. So
pretty much,
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass it off to Andy. Andy, teach us the voodoo ways of the web, please.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, everyone. This is nice. I was just thinking I haven't done an online talk since probably rusty doing it like this, but let's get cracking and see how we get on. So the aim of the game in this talk from me is I'm going to try and change the way that you write CSS. And I'm going to do that by introducing you to truly responsive web design using fluid type, fluid space, flexible layouts, and all underpinned by progressive enhancement. And this is the key, see, because on the web, we build for everyone, not just ourselves nor our peer groups, because the web is truly global. So we need to respond to that. And the browser's also a pretty hostile environment at times too. Obviously, with browser support being much better now and compat issues being few and far between, but you never know if a user's browser's got a bunch of extensions pulverizing the web page that you're on, or if they work in a corporate environment that strictly blocks resources. And this is why I leaned into progressive enhancement, because I think it's the best way to guarantee that everyone gets a good experience. Sure, some will get a much better experience than others, but the key is that everyone gets a good experience regardless of the device or connection speed. The thing is as well, no one will ever complain about getting a good experience. They'll never know whether the experience is better or worse than anyone else's, and mainly because they can do what they came to do and they don't need to think about how the website is performing. And that's proper web design as I see it. So you've got my reasoning, you understand why I'm doing things. So let's have a look at what we're doing today in this talk. We're going to build a website. So go ahead and visit this URL on the device that you've got with you right there. Now, we're doing this remotely, so you're probably sat on your computer, but if you've got a phone in your pocket, you've got a tablet, or you've got a laptop next to you, whatever, it doesn't matter because the website should look great for you. Now, if you haven't been able to get onto that while I've had that slide up, this is the website that we're dealing with today. Now, I've already designed and built this in advance. As you can see, it works well in all viewports. Everything responds well. The typography is scaled efficiently. And this whole methodology is written with very little CSS. So like I said earlier, you'll almost certainly rethink how you write CSS by the end of this session. At least I hope so anyway. Now I've got to do a little bit of boring tool talk to start with, just to give you some context about how things come together. So all the CSS that you see on screen today, it's all been bundled together with a bit of post CSS. And underpinning all of that is Tailwind CSS, which might surprise some of you that I'm using. But Tailwind CSS is really useful for dealing with design tokens for us and also generating utility classes that we might want to use. We're also using a CSS methodology, which in short is a set of principles and rules that help you to organize your CSS, and it also helps you to make decisions on how to author it. And today we're using a CSS methodology called Cube CSS. Now what Cube CSS is a methodology that's orientated towards simplicity, pragmatism, and consistency. And it's designed to work with the medium that you're working in, often the browser, rather than against it. And the key here is simplicity. We're hoisting as much CSS as high up as possible because the browser is incredibly powerful and it knows what to cascade and inherit based on rules that we program with our CSS. If you set stuff up high, elements deep in the HTML document will effectively style themselves, which is pretty magic, right? CSS is a seriously powerful programming language because of this. Now, I'm not going to go into loads of detail about QCSS today because it'll take up loads of time in this talk. If you are interested in more detail, I did do a talk a couple of years ago, which you can find on the Cube documentation, which is linked on the slide. But there's also loads of examples on how to do things, and there's loads for you to deep dive into if you're interested. But to keep everyone up to speed, so we're all singing off the same hymn sheet, I'll quickly run through the top level of Cube CSS. So it's broken up into 5 parts. First is the global CSS aspect, and that's the most important part of the CSS system. We want to define as much CSS as high up as we possibly can. And this, like I mentioned, allows the browser to cascade and inherit where it can. Why define things more than once when you don't have to, right? Leading into global CSS is a surefire way to write as little CSS as possible. And the C in Cube stands for composition. Now, composition is layout. And the composition layer's job is to create these flexible component agnostic layout systems that support as many variants of content as possible. What this means in human terms is it would define skeletal, flexible, and responsive layouts that should support any component that's dropped into them. Next up is the U, which stands for utility. Now, utility in the context of Cube CSS is a CSS class that does one job and does that one job well. The CSS class, more often than not, will only have one CSS property defined, such as a background color. Think Tailwind utilities for this. Then let's have a look at blocks, the B in Cube. A block is a skeletal component or organizational structure. To compare it to a common user interface element, it's your card element or a button element. And then finally is an exception. An exception is a deviation from the rules outlined in a block or a composition. Usually an exception is related to a state change. So for example, you might have a reverse state or an inactive state on a component. And with exceptions, we use HTML data attributes in CubeCSS. And the reason for this is finite state. So you can add as many classes as you like to an element. And the problem with adding lots of classes to an element is that you don't know which one's actually going to apply if they're all targeting the same thing. Whereas with a data attribute, you can only have one value. So you can guarantee that you've got a particular state. And that's the only time that in CubeCSS where we want to get as much control as possible. So that's the CubeCSS run through. Hopefully get a rough idea of what we're doing and how it works. And what I'll do throughout the talk as well is I'll refer back to where we are in the CubeCSS methodology where appropriate. Now let's take a look at some key bits of the HTML of the site first. We want to build a HTML version of the site first. And it's really important to use semantic HTML where possible, at least a good hierarchy of headings. But why do this? Well, the first reason is it gives tools that help other people consume information on websites a head start. Now, this could be a screen reader, it could be a reader view in your browser, or a scraping tool. The other thing is as well, if the CSS doesn't load, the website still makes sense. Because when you use semantic HTML, the browser's user agent style sheet kicks in, and it'll style elements correctly. So you can see headings, you can see lists, for example. And the main point as well is that old browsers are probably going to struggle with the modern front-end tech that we're talking about today. So solid HTML foundation helps those users, because they do still exist, consume content when this happens. Because we're building with progressive enhancement, their experience will be broken. It just might not look as good as someone else's experience. So the key is you get the HTML right and you've built a solid foundation. And if not, you're building on sand. And what happens when you build on sand? The house will sink. So this is the outline of our page. Now notice that we're splitting each section of the site up with article elements. You might think splitting up with sections is more appropriate. But in fact, articles are better for this. As Bruce Lawson wrote in Why You Should Choose HTML Article Over Section, they describe sections as more of a generic wrapper and articles as defined chunks of content. So we've got the overall article wrapped in a main element, and then each section is then broken up into articles, which helps the assistive tech to break the content up into sections too. So let's have a look at what we've got so far. Beautiful, right? We've got ourselves a good old web page made of HTML. And again, because we're using semantic HTML, the document reads absolutely fine and is broken up into clear headed sections with nice lists breaking content apart. And this is what I call the minimum viable experience. HTML is an exceptionally powerful language because when all else fails, which it will, HTML will effectively structure the page for everyone effectively. Lovely stuff. Now we'll talk about more HTML as we go along. I just wanted to show you what our baseline looks like. So let's get into what we're really talking about in this talk and start to make it look good. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to level the playing field a bit. And we're going to add a really light CSS reset. Now what CSS reset does is it helps to normalize the default styles added to a page by the browser. And back in the dark old days of cross-browser issues, CSS resets were especially helpful for this. I do still find them useful today, but I roll a much lighter reset out because browsers are so much more consistent now than they used to be. But I don't like some of the default styles with spacing and content flow. So I put that stock reset together and I've been tinkering with it for a few years now. So if you're interested, there's a link to an article that I wrote about it and broke each part of the reset down to explain the decision process. So again, let's just remind ourselves what our page looks like right now. All we've done is got semantic HTML and nothing else. And then we add this reset, and this is the reset I'm talking about. And it's only 43 lines of CSS. And I'll pop the code in a little reset CSS file that gets pulled in with post CSS. And it's pretty small, right? It's almost fully legible on a slide deck. And with that code in place, we get this. And it's not done a huge amount, has it? And that's perfect because the key thing of what we're doing today is we're not being heavy-handed. We're hinting the browser rather than micromanaging it. We're doing just enough to get a nice balance between control on our end while giving the browser plenty of space to do what it does so well, render websites. So we're starting to cook with gas. We've got our semantic HTML base, then we've added another layer to that with our reset. So let's keep moving and start applying some visual CSS. But before we do that, let's do some more foundational work and start to look at the globals. What also falls into globals, apart from applying global styles to element, is setting root variables or CSS custom properties. And this helps to create a consistent user interface. Now you can look at these like design tokens. They're constant values that give us that consistency at a high level. Now a little note on the side is these were actually generated by Tailwind CSS. I wrote a custom little bit of JavaScript that sucked up all of the utilities and then generated this block of custom properties. And this is a shorter block just so it fit on a slide. So there are constants. We've got them set high up. Then the next level is we're going to start adding our own variables too. These are some hand-authored variables. What we're doing here is we're taking those constants that we've already set, and then we're going to define some easier to use variables where we need to use them. So we've got ourselves a gutter, which is going to deal with spacing for us. We've got some border radius styles, a couple of transition styles, and then some tracking styles, which is the space between letters when you're reading content. Now we've got them set. We've got the constants, and then we've got the hand-authored, well, constants too, essentially. We've got ourselves a system in place, and we can start applying that system to the page. So because we're dealing with global CSS, the first thing we want to do is target the body element, and we're going to do as much as we can as high up. Now, every single property that we're setting here gets inherited by child elements by default. So setting the color, the background, the font size, the font family, light height, and the letter spacing. When we quickly look at our site now, you can see that it's had a massive impact on the overall look and feel, and that's because everything's been inherited. I know everything's bunched up, and we're going to deal with that in a second. But before we do that, let's set some typography rules instead. And with that, we're going to go on a little side quest, because this is my obsession in web design at the moment, and that's fluid typography and fluid space. I honestly think this is the nirvana of responsive web design. And to show you how it all works, I'm going to pair back and do a simple demo. Now, I could wax lyrical about the technical reasoning, but no, I'm just going to use this simple demo to show you this is the way to do things ideally. Let's say we're going old school, and we've decided that we've got 3 viewports, a phone, a tablet, and a desktop. Now, I personally don't like doing this because there's so much fragmentation with screen sizes that picking just 3 doesn't really check out. What I mean by that is this. Check out this diagram. It's from a 2015 Open Signal report on screen size fragmentation of Android devices. They're all different screen sizes. And let me remind you again, just Android devices. The report is 7 years old too, so consider how many different sizes have popped up since then. This again is just Android devices, and you can see there's a vast array of different sizes to deal with. So you can imagine if you're dealing with just 3 breakpoints, a lot's going to get missed out in between. So this demo here, it's got a heading, a few paragraphs, and a subheading between them, all sized using breakpoints. And as you can see, there's space between the breakpoints. I've slightly over-exaggerated it a little bit on this demo so you can see, but there's points where the typography is either way too big or way too small. And this is the CSS that defines those heading styles. And it's not too bad, right? We're using rem sizes, so that's good. And then we're building from mobile up or smallest viewport up. And in each media query, we're just increasing the font size. Now you think, well, that's fine, just add more breakpoints. We could do that. We could keep adding breakpoints. We'll add another one here. But how many breakpoints do we need to define to account for that huge array of screen sizes? Our CSS will get totally out of control. But I've got a solution. Let's switch to fluid type instead. Notice anything different? Yep, the text is auto-scaling based on the viewport bounds. Pretty handy, right? So let me show you how it's done. What we need to do is to use Css Clamp. Now, Clamp is a relatively new CSS function. What you do is you set a minimum size, an ideal size, and then a maximum size. So the minimum size here, we set a size of 2 rem. Now that's the size of text that we want for our smallest possible context. And I know we just talked about device fragmentation before, but it's useful to have locks at each side, smallest and largest. And the magic is in the middle. So what we're doing there is we're saying, ideally, try and size the font based on 5 portions of the viewport width. And then the part that we've added there as well is we're using calc to add 1 rem to that too. And the reason why we do that is if we just use viewport units and the user tries to zoom the text, the viewport decreases. So therefore, the text would never zoom. Now, applying a rem unit to it, I don't understand how this works, but it works. The browser turns it into something much smarter. It still uses the viewport sizes, but it also allows users to zoom text too. So it's a win-win for accessibility as well. And this is what we've got. It's our fluid type rule. And you see what we've done there? We've mentored the browser with some simple rules and let it make the right decision based on the viewport bounds, knowing full well that it won't get out of control because of our 2 lock sizes, the smallest and the largest. Before, we were micromanaging the browser by setting an obscene amount of static values that still didn't fix the problem. And now we've set a simple rule that scales the text for us by default. So now we know the how, but let's look at how we can get some design consistency in place too. Now we're going to use size scales on ratios, and we've been using these in design forever to create a step scale of sizes that are based off the scale version of the previous size. And this is what I'm talking about. This is a major third scale, and it's based off a ratio of 1.25. And this means as you step up the scale, you multiply the current size by 1.25 to get the next size. And you can see you got that lovely linear curve between the sizes. And that gives us rhythm on the page. To show you how the calculation goes, imagine you got a size of 1 rem by default. The next step up will be 1.25 rem. Then you go to 1.56, 1.95, 2.43. So the scale gradually increases as we go. So we've got the scale, but then what happens with, you've got a small viewport and then you've got a larger viewport. On the smaller viewport, you might want a smaller scale that the text increases by. And on a large viewport, where you've got more space, you want to use a more aggressive scale to get much bigger text sizes. Now, luckily, we've got ourselves a tool to do that. And this tool is called Utopia. And you can find that at utopia.fyi. And it was made by the devilishly clever folks at Clearleft, James Gillihead and Tris Mudford. And they're a dream team combination of a designer and developer that speak the same language as each other. What the tool allows you to do, as you can see on this slide, is you can set a viewport size and then a root font size and then the type scale that you want to do. So you see here we're using a quite larger font size for small devices with a smaller ratio. And then for larger viewports, we're increasing the size again and then using a much more aggressive type scale. And this is the one that we're using for our site right now. And that's gone more to the extreme. Because the headings are huge on the site, we want to use a really big type scale for where the space allows. And then for the smaller devices, we haven't got much space. So we're going to increase that size by a much smaller scale. Now, again, we talked about device fragmentation. And you can see here we're using viewports to size the scale. But for the context of this, we're saying, look, let's just use 320 pixels as our minimum. And then because anything that goes lower than that, the text won't scale down. It'll just be the root size. But then what we're doing is we're the central wrapper of the site. We're saying, okay, let's use that as our maximum and then let the type scale accordingly against that. And this is what you get. Now, the CSS isn't exactly readable, is it? It's generated these pretty complex like point values, but that's not important. The important thing is we can set these properties up with our other constants and our other variables. And then we've got a fluid type system and size scale built into our CSS. And this is what it looks like in isolation. Now we've got those size variables that we can set once and forget about, knowing that regardless of the viewport size and context, the text will be of an appropriate size. Look down the site again, and it looks like the text is sized perfectly to the device, right? All of this is based on those few lines of CSS, whether you're using a tiny little phone, a tablet, a laptop, or even a big old iMac like I'm using here. Spacing is near enough the same deal. The main difference is with Utopia, spacing uses a custom ratio, pardon me, rather than the two or more defined with type. Let's have a quick drink. So showing, looking at the scale now, you can see that we're setting these custom spaces between spacing, but we're still using fluidity to make it relevant for each viewport size. Now, you could, in theory, use the same scale that you've used for your typography, but what you might find then is that the difference between spaces is just too big, and you'll find like in between sizes that you're struggling with, whereas this gives you that little bit of extra control. What's also handy too in Utopia is you can set space in pairs. Now, how these work is it takes the smallest size from one scale and then takes the largest from the size up. And what that does, I'll show you on the site, is you can see the sections of content going there. Now, they've got a vertical padding value using the space scale. Pardon me. Now, with this, because you've got less space on a mobile device and much more space on a larger device, you've got room to maneuver. So these space pairs are really useful because you can create much larger sections on larger devices without having to write any more CSS. So that was a bit of an information overload, sorry. I wanted to cover the fluid stuff in detail though, because it's really important to this way of building websites. So much so that for now, because I run an agency for clients, it's a genuine red line for me. If they don't want to go down the fluid type and fluid space path, then we're not going to work well together. So we just don't do it. They can use whatever weird and wonderful tools and frameworks that they like, but fluid type and space is a must. So back to our little project. Let's add some more CSS to it. Now, just to recap, this is what we've added already to the body. Remember, all of these properties get inherited by the children. But now we want to start applying some detail. So we'll start dealing with the typesetting like I promised we would do a while ago before I sent us on a side quest. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to set the font sizes for our headings based on that size scale. And remember, it goes up in steps from step 0 or step -1 in our case, all the way up to step 5. Now, the font we're using is Inter, which looks great if you pull the letter spacing together a bit too for larger elements. So for H1, H2, and H3, we're using the smaller tracking, which reduces the space between letters. Now, you could use pixels here, but that, again, you wouldn't get that fluidity. So we're just using all these rules and these clamp rules to do everything for us. And the line height is done off a ratio. So by using a unitless value on the line height, it means that because we've got fluid type, that line height will be fluid by default too. Now, sticking with typesetting, let's set some line lengths. Now, the reason why we set line lengths is because imagine you've got a big block of text. If you don't set the maximum width that line can be, reading the text on a large screen is like this, right? And that's actually an accessibility issue because someone with cognitive issues finds it difficult to go from the end of one line to the start of another line if there's a big distance between them. So to get A, better accessibility, and B, to make your design look better, you should limit the length of your lines. Now, this is one of the best design tips I can ever give you, regardless if you're a designer or a developer, it doesn't matter. Setting shorter line lengths will make everything look better, especially in long form prose content. Now, the magic number ideally is about 65 characters. We do that with a CH unit. But because the type on this site is quite big and chunky, we're actually using 50 characters instead. And then for headings, we're knocking them down to 20 characters. And then the rest of the global CSS is, as you can imagine, like generic HTML elements for saying link styles, focus styles, etc. Now, I'm not going to go through all them in detail because we don't have time for that. But as you can see, plenty gets done high up, but also we're not writing loads of CSS. And that rather small amount of CSS has had an enormous impact on the look and feel of the site already. You can see the title lines, the heading hierarchy is in place now. We've still not sorted our spacing out, but we'll get onto that in a second. But everything's just looking better, and we've still written very little CSS, especially if you discount the blocks of custom properties we've added. So we've sorted our global CSS for now. So let's start adding some real detail to the page. And we'll start with some utility classes first. Now we're going to start, I mentioned utilities at the start of the talk and said that generally the rule is that they do one property. Now that's true, but we're also going to have some utilities that add multiple properties. But the difference is that rather like a CSS, like a BEM block, for example, that defines like background, padding, spacing, margin, the idea of a utility is that it sets very small amount of related properties to each other instead. The first one we'll add, though, is a single liner. Now, this is my favorite 3 lines of CSS, and it's called the flow utility. Now, if you've read every layout, which is book co-authored with Hayden Pickering, we call this the stack. But I prefer the name flow. I don't want to get into it. We had a debate. We settled on stack. But flow, I think, because it describes the flow and rhythm of items on the page. Now, let me break down what it's doing. We'll start with the selector. So we've got our flow class, and then we're using a lobotomized our selector, and that's the star, the plus, and the star. Now, that targets sibling elements that sit next to each other in the DOM. But what I also add is an arrow combinator there too. And what that does is it selects only direct children rather than all of the children inside of the element. And that just gives you a little bit more control, because if you just do star plus star, every single child element that falls under flow will then have margin top applied to it. And at that point, things can get way out of hand. So adding that one little arrow combinator just gives us that tiny bit of control that we need. And this is how it works. So looking back at the selector, we're saying margin top, and we're looking for a variable called flow space. And if flow space cannot be found, we're setting the default value for it to fall back on, which is 1em. Now, 1em is the size of the type that's being computed by the browser at any given time. So depending on how big the text is, the flow space will be affected. And because it doesn't add anything to the first element either. So you can see the heading's got no margin on it. But then the paragraph that follows that and then the paragraph that follows that one have both got 1em of space on them. And that's taking the font size of that paragraph at the time. Now you can see that in action with the subheading, because that's got a larger font size. The flow space is bigger by default. Now, we don't have to set a value for flow space, because if we're using 1em all the time, because we're using a fluid scale and we're using a ratio, you're going to have natural flow and rhythm by default, because it's all based on the current type size. But also, it's nice to give yourself a bit of control too. And this is the magic of the utility. You see there, we've got a context. And if a flow utility finds itself in the class called myContext, the flow space will be set to 10rem, so static value. And then what you get then is this. So these CSS custom properties also have affected by cascade and inheritance too. So it means we can do some really powerful stuff with them, which gives them a bit more power than, say, like Sass variables. So that was quick and easy. And let's add another quick and easy one. So I've mentioned these sections of content already, and you see they've all got consistent padding on each one, like consistent spacing. Now, we want to use padding for that because we've got fill colors on the back of them. So we can create another utility that sets 2 properties for us instead of just 1. That's what I was talking about earlier. Now, we're using the same methodology here. We're looking for a value of region space. And if region space can't be found, then we're going to use one of the space pairs that we talked about earlier from the space scale. So you apply region to any element, it'll have that top and bottom padding. And then if the context that you're in defines region space, it'll pick that. Otherwise, it'll take the fallback. And here it is doing its job. applying consistent vertical space, which increases rather dramatically as the viewport increases. We just set it and forget it. And whenever we need some consistent region content, we can go ahead and slap that region utility on it. Now let's take a look at the site now that we've added those two utilities, and you can really start to see what impact these tiny snippets of CSS are adding to everything. We've got flow and rhythm between content, and then we've also got these nice big chunks of space that are breaking the site into sections. Now, it doesn't look great at the moment, does it? Because we've not added any design detail to it, but you can really start to see how everything starts to come together. So let's start to add some layout. We've only got two layouts to add to this website, but the magic of layout in CSS is these skeletal layouts can have any content in them. It doesn't matter. The whole idea is that you're building a scaffold for the website. So the first composition we're going to work on is a grid. Now, grids are by far the most popular layout on the web, and also the most engineered too. And I'm going to show you how you can get a nice level of control while maintaining maximum responsiveness with no breakpoints. The grid will power the cards at the top of the site here, and also it'll power this little tools section at the bottom. And I notice at the top we've got a 2x2 grid, and then at the bottom we've got 3x3. Now you might be thinking, surely at this point they're going to use a media query to do that, but we're not. We're going to use the CSS grid system instead. Now, magic thing with CSS grid is we can use auto placement. And we can tell the grid items to either create more items to fill the space or to stretch the items where possible in order to fill a specific size. Now, this little grid composition that we've got here, by default, will try and create more items to fill available space. And then inside of there, we're using CSS grid's min-max function. And what you're doing there is you say what the minimum size is and the maximum size of each column. So again, we're using that same model in the minimum size. We're saying if a grid min item size variable has been defined, use that. Otherwise, set the minimum to be about 16 rem. And then in the maximum size, we're saying use 1FR, which is one fractal unit, so one portion of the remaining space. And this is what we get when we apply it to those cards. It doesn't look great, does it? And it might be the point where you start to think, surely we're going to add some explicit CSS to force this into shape right. But we're not, because we're not micromanagers. We're going to give the browser a helping hand instead. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a row of lists to the list, which you might be thinking, that's ridiculous. You don't need to do that, do you? But this is a bug, a browser bug that's turned into an opportunity for us. In Safari voiceover, in some older versions of Safari, if you add a CSS class to a list, it removes the list semantics from it, which is bonkers, I know. But we can use that as a hook because we can make an assumption. If you're adding a class to a list, there's a good chance that you don't want it to look like a list anymore, a traditional list. So in our global styles and in the CSS reset, the first thing the CSS reset is looking for this, and it's saying if there's a row of list, remove list styling from it. And then in our global CSS, we've enhanced that. We said also remove the padding too. And then we get this. It's better, but it's still not looking great, is it? It would actually look better than two columns, and that's what we're trying to achieve. So now you're probably thinking, surely this is where we start to apply media query. But we don't. We're going to use Clamp to do it instead. The first thing we do, we're going to create an exception. And just to remind you, an exception is a state variant. And I talked about how we use data attributes to do this. So we apply a data attribute of 50/50 to the list element. And then inside of there, all we're doing is we're setting these custom property values that the layout's already looking for. So the first thing we're doing is saying grid placement auto fit. So instead of creating new items to fill the space, we're saying, look, if you can stretch the items a bit more, then do that, but otherwise create a new item. So we're just, again, hinting the browser to do something for us. And then we're setting the grid min item size too. And the beauty of using Clamp is you don't have to do everything as an exact science. So we can say, okay, minimum, we'll stick with 16, that's fine. But ideally, aim for 50 VW, so that's half of the viewport. But we know that it's never going to be half of the viewport because we've got a wrapper that contains things. But that doesn't matter. We're just giving the browser an idea of what we're trying to achieve. And then finally, we set a maximum value because we don't want the grid items to blow up too much. And then with that, we've got ourselves a completely responsive grid system. And the browser's making the decision up for us. It knows, okay, this is what they're trying to achieve, and this is what I've got. So I'm either just going to stack them, or as I've got more space, I'm going to apply a 50-50 layout. This is exceptionally powerful and exceptionally simple too. So let's just have a little breather and look where we're at. We've got semantic HTML as our base. Then we've got Css Reset. On top of that, we've got some constants and some design tokens. Then some hand-rolled variables, some global CSS, some utilities, and then finally layout compositions. So we're building things up in a standard order. Now we can finally start to apply some design detail. So let's focus our attention on the cards at the top again, because I really want to show you some more progressive enhancement before we finish. So let's apply the base style that gives you those dark backgrounds and the light text. And it's all pretty straightforward, right? Background, color, padding, border radius, and then we're unsetting the max width. You might think, well, why is he doing that? If you remember back to our global CSS, we set a max width on paragraphs, lists, and block quotes with the character units to make sure that our flow content doesn't grow too large. Now, there's an assumption to be made here that there's a good chance that a card's going to be a list element. So just to be sure, with our blocks, we're going to undo that global style. And that's the whole point of a block, is when you're going against the global styles. So when we've applied that, it looks like this. It looks pretty cool, right? It looks okay. It could be better. You know, we've got that big old space at the bottom of the card on the bottom left there. So let's try and improve that. What would work really well here is a masonry layout. Now we can do all that with a one-liner in CSS. We used to have to do it with JavaScript, but good old CSS has given us the tools to do it. Now the problem is it's not very well supported yet. In fact, you can only see it in Firefox when you've got an experimental flag turned on. But this is where progressive enhancement steps in. We know we've got a good baseline, which is what you can see on the screen. And we can enhance that. So that's our minimum viable experience, and we're going to enhance it instead. So we're going to first, we're going to add another data attribute to our list. So you can see our data layout already there, 50-50. Then we add a new one called data rows equals masonry. And then in our grid composition, so going back to our composition quickly, we're saying if the data rows equals masonry, set grid template rows to masonry, and then a line item start. Now that makes no difference if masonry layout is supported. But what it does do is it gives us this by default. And this is what it looks like if a browser doesn't support masonry layout. And I can almost guarantee that the vast majority of it that will open this website didn't even notice that this should be a masonry layout. And that's the beauty of progressive enhancement, because you're not supposed to notice if things aren't quite optimal, because everything just works. And then when you open it in Firefox, it's got the flag set. You can see it's just repositioned some of the columns, and it's given us a nice masonry layout. Now, just quickly, I'm just going to show you again how we can use blocks as a configuration object for everything else, because I know we're running out of time now. So we've got this grid layout again. So let's make it a 3-column grid. And instead of doing it as a compositional exception, we'll do it as a block instead. So imagine this is called features. And inside of features, because custom properties cascade and inherit, we can say, right, we've got a grid in there. So we'll set some rules for it. So again, we set the grid placement to auto fit. We set the min item size, we clamp again, 16 rem at the bottom, 20 rem at the top. And then we're saying take 33% of the space available to give us a 3-column grid. And again, we don't have to do 33.333%. We can just say, look, aim for 33%. We change the gutter and we change the flow space. And that's all we've got in that block. We had a little bit more CSS to make things look cool, but really that block's just a configuration block. And then what we get is this nice responsive version of the site with that block running a 3-column grid if it's got space, or it stacks onto a single column if there's no space. And that's that. Now, I've had to rush through this for this talk, but if you want to look at this source code and the site in more detail and play with it in different viewports and play around with the configurations, then I put our source code up on Glitch for you. Glitch is a bit like CodePen, but a bit fancier. So go around, play with it, see what you think, see if you can make it look cooler than what I've already done. So let's just close out with a bit of a conclusion. We've never had it better with browsers. when I came into this industry back in 2009, responsive web design was just about to come in, and we were plagued with IE6 and IE7 support. And the worst part was there was a period where we had to build responsive websites that also supported IE6, which is just pure hell. And I think a lot of frameworks and over-engineered CSS approaches are a response to that hostile environment. But the environment now couldn't have been more friendlier. Now these extremely heavy-handed tools are redundant. But I don't like to think of them as redundant. I like to think of them as repurposed instead. Now, Tailwind's a great example of a tool that can be heavy-handed, but we're using Tailwind in this project. But instead of applying lots and lots of utility classes or creating these very specific blocks out of the utility classes, all we're doing is using it to generate a couple of utilities for us and generate some custom properties. And then it's just done. That's Tailwind's job finished. So you might be thinking, right, well, that site is pretty cool, but I want to see something big and proper that's been built with this. Like this surely the system doesn't scale. And I can tell you right now that it does scale. So I'll show you a couple of examples. So the first one that Michael mentioned, I came in and worked on the web dev design system and redesign. And this site uses all the aforementioned tools and techniques. There's slightly more specific CSS in that project, but we've got the fluid type, we've got fluid space. We're using the Cube CSS methodology, and we've got this beautiful responsive site. It's a huge site, and the CSS code base is nice and light. And just a quick content warning, there's quite a lot of glitching and flashing on this next site, which I'll show you. And this is the other end of the scale. So this is the super creative part. So obviously I work for a creative agency. You might think, well, this site that you're showing me now surely doesn't use the same methodology, but it does. Because we're building up with progressive enhancement, we're styling as much as we can as high up as possible. We can add this flair and these extra little tricks because we know that core experience is solid for the user, regardless of what device they've got. So to close, I'll leave you with this message. Remember, be the browser's mentor, not its micromanager, and always challenge over-complex solutions. And that might be an overcomplicated solution that you've come up with or someone else has come up with. But mainly, go forth and build excellent websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. That was an incredible talk. I think this is the second time I've got to listen to it, and I still feel like there's a lot for me to absorb and digest from there. So we'll give it a minute or two to see if our audience has any questions. But I am a little curious. I was reading earlier. Yep, Yuval says that was an excellent talk, and he's really excited to be testing Clamp and Flow stuff. That's awesome. Loving the presentation. I was curious how you. So you're the creator, the inventor, so to speak, of Cube CSS, and I'm curious what brought you to the what got you to the point where you decided, okay, there's all these different methodologies, but these don't seem to be working for me. How did you decide to create your own methodology for CSS?
So I used to do everything with BEM. All right, so I really got into BEM. Harry Roberts, a friend of mine, but his stuff back in the day with BEM was great, and Inuit CSS, and that worked really well when we had like terrible browsers and everything needed to be super strict. But what I found with BEM was it was a bit too heavy-handed. As I've done like design system work for years and years, and it felt like a good idea at the time, but we sort of coded ourselves into a corner a lot. So all Cube CSS is an evolution of me going from BEM to sort of grabbing a bit, giving the browser more and more control. And it got to the point where I thought I'd better formalize this in documentation because it no longer makes sense on its own anymore. And that was it. And the rest is history, as it were.
Sure. We do have from one of our audience members. Could you share the URL to the glitch that you?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll fire that slide up and then play there. This means I can't see you anymore, but that's cool. There you go. If you want to put the deck back on, yeah.
All right, that is up for our audience to take a look at. I'm trying to see, do we have anything? Nothing else. I guess just my next question is, do you have any additional resources that you think our audience can take a look at if they're interested in getting a deeper dive into this whole like mentality of like minor suggestions to the browser and letting the browser handle it based on rules instead of specific instructions?
Yeah, so if you go to the URL that's shared right at the start of the talk, so the site we've just built, that site is just one big article that essentially breaks down exactly what I've just done in this talk as an article and gives you links out to tools and stuff that I like to use too. But the other place is just the Cube documentation site. There's loads of examples on there, and it goes into more detail about the methodology, and that's cube.fyi.
So cube.fyi for the Cube documentation, and then the website that's the presentation, it's build excellent websites, and there's a dot.
That's right.
In websites, like, so website.es.
Yeah.
So that's weird for me to phrase it.
Yeah, I didn't think about that when I actually bought the domain, but I
think it's
cool.
I think it looks good too. Do you have anything else you want to share with our audience?
No, I think hopefully that talk's giving you the lowdown of how I like to do things.
I definitely think so. Then I will say thank you, Andy, for giving this talk to our audience. And to one question sliding in real quick.
Okay.
How can we apply these fluid spaces in typography with a design in Figma already designed in fixed screen sizes, fixed font sizes, and fixed spaces? Any thoughts on this?
So that's a good question, because that's the situation a lot of people are going to find themselves in, right? It's hard to do it in an existing site without doing some major refactoring. Now, what I do in Figma is I set two viewports, the minimum and the maximum. And then using the rules that I was talking about before, the minimum viewport has the minimum text size, and then the maximum viewport has the maximum text size. Now you might be thinking, well, what about the in between? Well, that's the whole point of this talk, is that when you set these layout rules, then you should accept that all of the vast screen sizes in between those are just going to have to work it out the best they can. So you just got to give decent hints to the browser to say, right, good examples, that grid system. So he said, look, ideally it could be 33%. But if I just give it some lock sizes either side, I know the cards aren't going to be huge on like a weird phablet or whatever they call these days, like the larger phones. And it's also not going to be too small as well. So it'll always be of a reasonable size. So it's a complete mind shift change. If you're designing very specifically very rigid sizes now, the first part of call is to try and loosen that for yourself and trust the browser more and trust yourself more as well.
And so getting that, like the minimum viewport and maximum viewport, you're putting those variables into Clamp. So you have Clamp, the minimum, what you're hoping for, and then the maximum. And then the browser will figure it out from there. So
yeah, and that's what you're putting into Utopia as well. So you're saying, look, this is the minimum viewport, and this is the maximum viewport. So it's all relative as well.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we'll call it here now. So Andy, I will thank you for your time. I know it's probably a little late for you as well as for some of our audience members. Thank you everyone for joining us. We do these meetups roughly once a month, so stay tuned for next month's meetup. However, as a quick plug, I recommend you all to visit application.com. There's a link right on the homepage to join our Discord, so you can join our developer community, where we also run monthly office hours, which is exclusive to our Discord community. Last month, we hosted our VP of Research and Development, Ariel, who discussed microservice architecture. And next week, we'll be hosting our CEO and co-founder, Yuval Hazaz, who's going to be discussing taking an open source project to a full-fledged company-like application. So I invite you guys to visit that. Also, find Andy on Twitter. I try to remember your Twitter handle because it's not Andy Bell. It can't be easy.
I'll do the last slide. That's got all of the stuff on there. There you go.
Okay, so it's in the bottom left corner, but follow Andy on Twitter as well. And I think that's going to be it. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.